It's my pleasure to introduce Leif Brottem as our speaker today. Leif is an associate professor of global development studies at Grinnell College. He's a UW-Madison alum with a PhD in geography. He's spending his sabbatical year with us as a visiting scholar with the African Studies program. Today, Leif will be presenting findings of his work investigating the causes of different forms of insecurity in the Sahel. The Sahelian region is widely considered to be one of the most vulnerable regions of the world to climate change. It is also has painfully experienced rising rates of violence tied to various insurgency movements. This has led to significant academic and non-academic speculation of the linkages between environmental scarcity and insecurity in the region. Leif's background and experience is uniquely well placed for addressing this question, a question that remains underexplored with rigorous research. He has contributed significantly to our knowledge about how climate variability affects land use strategies of farmers and herders, and how these may or may not lead to small-scale resource-related conflict. In addition, he has done important work on the relationships between customary and formal government authority at the administrative district scales. All this work is performed with careful attention to the micropolitics that surrounds resource access in Sahelian rural settings. More recently, he has tied this experience to work looking at more organized insurgencies in the region. Not surprisingly, this has led to a range of international agencies seeking him out for advice on issues of security in the region. We are lucky to hear him speak on this topic today. So let's welcome Leif Brottem to African at Noon and to African Studies, our African Studies community here on campus.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I wanted to start by describing a recent incident that can tell us a lot about this urgent issue. In April of 2020, a young livestock shepherd was perched in one of the trees that dot the savanna landscape of Kalale, Benin. He was lopping the branches of a tree to provide leafy fodder to the cattle in his steed when two local farmers, including the presumptive owner of the field, arrived on the scene and demanded that he stop. When he continued, one of the men began firing on the shepherd with his slingshot. The second shepherd on the scene quickly ended that with a few well-placed blows of his machete. To make a sad story short, this incident ended with a reprisal attack that led to 78 houses and 38 granaries being destroyed, the theft of over 2 million naira, the national currency of Nigeria, and one death of a child. What can we learn from this tragic incident in order to better understand the multiple crises that are affecting various parts of Western Africa? And we must learn something because this local conflict, which turned violent, took place at the leading edge of jihadist expansion in West Africa. The kind of tit-for-tat violence seen in Kalale, which involves collective punishment, theft, and killings, is probably the biggest driver of communal violence in Mali, Nigeria, and other countries. But what are the root causes of these tragedies, which have taken thousands of lives in recent years? Are they climate wars? Are they the outcome of failed governance? Of course, it's more complicated than these widely circulating narratives suggest. They do represent an urgent challenge in West and Central Africa, as this figure shows. Since 2010, there have been over 15,000 deaths linked to farmer-herder violence. Half of those have occurred since 2018, and they are highly concentrated in 3 countries. Let's begin by taking a closer look at this incident in Kalale. First, it is important to know how vital livestock production is to West African economies and livelihoods. Livestock production involves at least 20 million people across West Africa. If labor and organic manure are counted as livestock products, the sector's contribution to agricultural GDP is nearly 50% for the region. Nonetheless, the sector has historically been neglected by governments, and livestock keepers have seen their access to natural resources, especially pasture and water, drastically diminish over the past several decades. Climate change and insecurity are making this problem worse. It is becoming very difficult for many livestock herders to make a living in what can be described as a vicious cycle of violent displacement and fraying social bonds. In Kalale, the cutting of tree branches was the immediate trigger of the violence, which embodies many of the challenges at hand. We need to put ourselves in the place of the herder who is doing it. In dryland West Africa, the months of April and May are the cruelest time for livestock. The previous year's grass have long dried up, crop residue is gone, and yet animals, of course, still need to eat to stay alive. At that time of year, the majority of herders rely on feeding their cattle the leaves of trees whose branches must be cut down to do so. But tree lopping, as it is known, puts them into direct conflict with farmers and forestry agents. While herders defend this practice as sustainable, at least from their perspective, farmers and many others argue that it reduces tree generation and contributes to resource degradation. For everyone who's been to this part of Africa, you've probably seen the distinctive looking trees that result from this practice. The farmers in Kalale may have been understandably upset by seeing trees on their land being impacted this way. Then again, their land is operative here. Perhaps they were angered about where the herders were cutting trees and whether in their minds, an unspoken property rights agreement had been violated, especially if the herders had not asked permission. That of course raises the question, why was the herder cutting branches in that place at that time? If we could have asked, he might well have said that there was no more grass in the places where he liked to graze his herd. Could climate change induced rainfall patterns be making that problem worse? That could be a climate change dimension to this conflict, but we cannot be sure. Political ecology is a critical social science framework for studying how power relations shape access to environmental resources. It has long included the notion that resource conflicts are not always about the resources themselves, but represent, to paraphrase Watson Peluso, stages for other kinds of political struggles and injustices against peasant communities. But there are real limits to this argument. Political ecologists also tend to overlook the kind of land degradation that local people view in the most serious of terms. Resources are degraded in northern Benin, and I argue here today that in order to understand how and why this matters, we must move beyond certain assumptions about rural livelihoods in the region and the sources of stress on them. Yet political ecology and its focus on large-scale structures is still vital. Today, you'll see the dark side of global trade, especially for illegally cut timber, and you will see a government that fails to serve its people, especially those living in rural areas. But by maintaining a lens grounded in peasant moral economies, we miss the most important ways in which rural West Africans get by and how their livelihoods intersect with forces of insecurity. One very important takeaway is that due to the ways that rural people live today, their moral economies involve a lot more side hustles in the informal economy. Unfortunately, as much as I would love to, we're not going to have time to disentangle those threads today. Instead, let's start by talking about those Naira. Why did a community of livestock herders in Benin hold a big pile of Nigerian cash? Kalale is close to the border and pastoralists have been settling on the Benin side for some years, but clearly maintain ties to their country of origin. Could this not have been a conflict about belonging and nationality? Such conflicts are recurrent, and the Nigerian media has for years vilified pastoralist herders as foreign terrorists. The federal and state government have taken big steps towards outlawing them from the entire country. That's part of a broader trend that is increasingly hostile towards pastoralism, not just in Nigeria, but Benin as well. Yet in Nigeria, climate change is widely seen as a root cause of the violent conflict that plagues so many parts of the country. Climate and political belonging could be mutually reinforcing stressors in this situation. To quote leading conflict scholar Marshall Burke, rising temperatures and weather shocks are a finger on the scale that makes underlying conflict worse. As usual, the media is way out in front of the research community on this one. Influential outlets on The Economist magazine, such as The Economist magazine, regularly describe a connection between jihadist insurgency and local conflicts over land and water in West Africa. In the research community, a fragile consensus has emerged over the past few years. The climate does indeed contribute to conflict around the world. Experts estimate that 3 to 20% of organized armed conflict has been influenced by climate over the past century. That would suggest that the actions of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State in West Africa could have a climate connection. But the same expert group acknowledges that specific mechanisms, those that operate at the local level, remain a key uncertainty. In short, theory building remains a tall task. Two frequently discussed theories that are relevant to Kalale include natural resource dependency and climate-induced migration. More specifically, some researchers have found a connection between drought duration and reliance on agriculture, rain-fed agriculture and livestock husbandry across sub-Saharan Africa, where joining an armed group or a rebellion becomes more appealing when other ways of making a living become unviable, especially when your government is not coming to your aid. In terms of new migration patterns, conflict could result from pastoralist herders moving from the Sahel to more humid countries such as Benin in search of water and pasture to sustain their herd during the dry season, which can last up to 9 months. The April 2020 incident and other violent farmer-herder disputes that have occurred in Kalalei since then could be the result of weak social ties and misunderstanding around environmental resources. It's true that these herders will always retain a certain level of Nigerianness in the eyes of Beninese peasant communities that hold claims to autochthonous land rights. But beyond that, herders have been passing through and even settling in these areas for decades, though not always peacefully. It is worth pointing out also that those past peasants also originally came from Nigeria just longer ago. But Kalalei is instructive vis-a-vis the West African climate conflict nexus in one other way. It is located at the crossroads of the two regions' epicenters of violent insurgency. Insurgents linked to the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and the regional Al-Qaeda franchise have used the nearby W. Panjari National Park as a hideout and as a way to travel between Burkina Faso and Nigeria. Unfortunately for Kalalei, it is a hop, skip, and a jump to Nigeria's Kainji National Park, which is also a haven for bandits and other armed groups. Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliates, along with Boko Haram, are among the most important organized armed groups involved in armed conflict in the region. It is often said that these movements are linked, even perhaps rooted, in the kind of resource conflict described in Kalalei through several possible channels. Disenfranchised youth may join up, or armed groups may exploit local conflicts to build political influence in rural communities. So what is the connection then, if there is one, between the April 2020 event and the growing presence of armed insurgents right around Kalalei? Climate conflict discourse and theory would suggest that extremist groups instrumentalize herders' grievances surrounding resource access, which is deeply connected to their status as outsiders, presumed to be, rightly or wrongly, from somewhere else. It is true that pastoralist communities have long lived at the margins in these areas, partly due to their mobile livelihoods, but also due to the orientations of post-colonial West African nation states. This is a crux issue where we all must be very cautious. In fact, this linkage is the current West African iteration of what sociologist Morton Boas calls crisis knowledge, the use of expert authority to legitimize analysis that may lack solid empirical foundations. And this is a life or death matter for rural dwellers, especially pastoralists who may already be seen suspiciously by local officials and security agents. It's worth stating, though, that when the Beninese government launched Operation Imo Nlede in Kalalei, which you see here, it was just doing its job and confronting a real threat to its own security. Yet one only needs to look to Mali, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria to see the tragedy that has befallen pastoralist civilians at the hands of security forces conducting counterinsurgency operations, with the suspicion that pastoralists support or protect insurgents. So this is a real dilemma for researchers and decision makers. The debate about root causes is never likely to be settled. The conflict and the need for a response is happening right now. So there will always be a need for crisis knowledge. The question is how to avoid reinforcing false narratives and justifying ineffective policies. Operation Imo Nlede points to another less discussed risk, which is that even when there is not a direct linkage between climate change and insurgency, they can intersect geographically with important impacts on resource users. Climate change quite possibly does influence the degree to which pastoralists depend on cutting tree branches. My own research in Benin and Mali shows that nearly all herders cut branches, and it is getting more difficult to find the trees that they are looking for. Increasingly, they can only find them in protected forest reserves, the same territories where counterinsurgency forces carry out their patrols. But such operations are relatively infrequent. Livestock herders are much more likely to encounter and interact with armed non-state actors present in the same remote areas. Evidence from Mali suggests that even when there is an antagonism between these groups, some kind of mutual understanding is likely, and collaboration, even if it is very passive, is certainly possible. This is true when it comes to securing access to resources, but also different kinds of trafficking and resource extraction. So these are the new action spaces in the subregion that are found within the boundaries of protected areas, forest reserves, as well as national parks. Historically speaking, these protected areas represent forms of colonial dispossession, but Alice Kelly's insightful study of the Waza National Park in Cameroon shows us they are also sites of ongoing contestation and negotiation between local people and authorities of various stripes. That study also describes the dynamics surrounding West African protected areas that are often invoked in discussions about violent insecurity, W. Punjari chief among them. In those areas, local people benefit and demand state protection from non-state armed groups, including those who come to poach wildlife and cut down trees illegally. Research that focuses on the colonial legacy of dispossessions flattens this complex action space and is prone to misinterpreting various property claims, local interests, and political motives. It becomes another misleading form of crisis knowledge. To fully understand these situations and the opportunities or threats they pose, we need to be clear-eyed about them. Credible sources describe the outsized role that pastoralists of the Fulani ethno-linguistic group play in certain armed groups, notably the Malian affiliate of Al-Qaeda known as Katiba Masina. A growing body of research argues that armed groups appeal to herders because not only are they politically marginalized, they are persecuted by state actors, including in the realm of everyday resource use like tree branch cutting that led to the violence in Kalale. Branch cutting is illegal in these countries, and herders get fined or physically punished for it when they get caught. This is one potential connection between pastoralist involvement in insurgencies and the climate conflict theory based on resource dependency. Herders depend on cutting tree branches and forest reserves more than ever, but it remains illegal. This connection is captured by the concept of pastoral populism, which argues that this kind of persecution generates grassroots legitimacy of armed groups within pastoralist communities. This, of course, suggests that Beninese authorities and other political actors should take a close look at local resource conflicts, especially those that turn violent, and many of them have in northern Benin over the past 12 to 24 months. More broadly, pastoral populism could be a credible way to explain the geographic spread of violent conflict outward from central Mali, shown on the left, into Burkina Faso, Niger, and potentially coastal countries as well. But is this an accurate way to explain this expansion? Again, I would argue that one must tread very carefully on this question, not only due to the limited empirical evidence at hand, but also due to weaknesses of certain assumptions that support it. Now, this is not to say that armed groups are not trying to establish themselves in local communities. They are. In central Mali, which has seen some of the highest levels of violence in the entire region, Katiba Masina has gained power in part by forcefully and effectively resolving conflicts, often between farmers and livestock herders. When another branch cutting incident in the community down the road from Kalale led to collective reprisals and 9 people being killed, credible sources in a report published by the Klingendale Institute recount that armed insurgents arrived quickly after the attack to attempt to offer their mediation services. What I heard was that thanks but no thanks was apparently the response. How are the insurgents able to show up in that village so quickly? Because it's very close to the W. Punjari National Park where they were likely hiding out. I point this out because the landscape of protected areas plays a very important role in influencing armed group strategy, tactics, and their relations with local communities. It is well known that armed groups, whether interested in doing illegal business, carrying out political agendas, or both, base their operations in protected areas around the world because they offer good hiding places. The FARC in Colombia is probably the best example of this, but Nigeria, which has suffered far more intercommunal violence than other countries in the region, also has a difficult mix of insurgency and criminality within its forest reserves. This geography plays a very important role in regional conflict dynamics. And here you see just how much of the region's territory is within protected reserves. And I would add that the United Nations is actually hoping to greatly expand the percentage of territory under protection. So this is a challenge that might actually get worse. In Nigeria alone, there are approximately 10 million square kilometers spanning 440 gazetted protected forest reserves in the country. And to demonstrate the importance, here you see that the maximum distance to a forest reserve in Nigeria is 79 kilometers. The average distance is only 13, and 20% of the national territory is within 5 kilometers of a forest reserve. So if these are quote unquote ungoverned spaces, or at least minimally surveilled territories, they play an instrumental role in that country's ongoing security crisis. A key question here is whether such groups are acting on legitimate grievances that local people have about denied access to natural resources within them, or are armed groups simply securing their hideouts when they attack forestry agents? Although these two dimensions are clearly distinct, they often become conflated in debates on the issue. What I want to do now is contrast two places where protected areas are acting as action spaces for well-organized armed insurgencies as a way to explore whether there are meaningful connections to local grievances. The Baole National Park Biosphere Reserve in Western Mali and the W. Panjari Park in northern Benin are instructive because insurgent groups have been operating them for at least 2 years. Mali's Baole National Park is an important node in Al-Qaeda's attempted westward expansion, which has caused Senegal to fortify its eastern border with Mali. W. Panjari is at the crossroads of groups operating in eastern Burkina Faso, western Niger, and northwestern Nigeria. Both are places where I've spent a lot of time and I know well. The Katiba Messina invaded the Baole Park in Mali from the north following the standard insurgent playbook. They killed a few forest guards, chased the rest off, took their vehicle and equipment and fled into a remote part of the park where they still are. Point number one is that the only people who regularly venture into these areas are hunters and pastoralists, a fact that has major security implications for protected area management. Out of 25 herders that my Malian partners surveyed in August, 5 reported having direct interactions with the insurgents. Based on the accounts of their meetings, the guys did not make a good first impression. Armed insurgents threatened anyone they encountered, and in at least one instance, kidnapped a boy from a pastoralist camp, though thankfully his father was able to retrieve him unharmed. And I do want to take a moment here to emphasize in a very personal way the everyday peril that these people face in their lives, and also the risks that people collecting information on them undertake. These are very dangerous topics to discuss in the areas that I've described today, and that's a real dilemma in building understanding of what's going on in them. Insurgents reportedly approach pastoralist camps at night and couch their introductions in terms of Islamic preaching and scholarship. Insurgents confronted a local imam in the mosque on the night of Maulud last year, claiming the right to preach. The imam denounced them and stood them down, an act of incredible bravery given that insurgents have killed imams in other parts of Mali. They are still there and are likely responsible for 2 fatal attacks in the month of September, one against a Moroccan truck heading to Bamako, and a second against the convoy coming from one of the country's industrial gold mines. I could go on with more details, but the main message I want to convey is that this group currently has little support in the area. People do not want them there, but in the absence of an effective security response, they'll be sticking around. 21 out of 25 of pastoralists who were surveyed expressed an unfavorable or very unfavorable opinion of the insurgents, who I might add, Malians refer to as jihadists. It is worth noting that here, 4 individuals do not hold unfavorable attitudes towards them. 2 of them said they were very favorable. One could reasonably argue that this could represent enough local support for the group to find a foothold in the area. I've heard such an account for the dynamics within Nigerian village communities where Boko Haram operates. However, although local people generally view the Baole National Park as legitimate and worth protecting, livestock herders are taking advantage of the jihadists' presence in the park to access resources within it. However, based on conversations my colleagues have had with them, this appears to be purely opportunistic, and the armed group inside the park is more interested in protecting its ability to launch attacks against state actors than it is in protecting the needs of herders. In Western Mali, the practice that draws the ire of herders, farmers, and conservationists is illegal logging, which has devastated not only the Baole Park, but also protected woodlands across West Africa. Before I shift gears and conclude by discussing illegal logging and what I call weak state political ecology, I want to share some of the results of the same survey conducted amongst herders outside of W. Panjari Park in northern Benin, because they differ in important ways from what I learned in Mali. That survey produces important similarities and differences. None of the 35 respondents had interacted with the insurgents, which reflects the security context of that park and how insurgents are using it. However, opinions were much more favorable towards the insurgents than in Mali. Only 8 out of 35 expressed negative opinions of them, 5 expressed neutral views, and 10 stated that they did not have one. Perhaps more importantly, 27 stated that the insurgents could achieve a measure of popular support in the area, largely by intervening in land conflicts. This contrasts with Mali, where over 80% did not feel a group would gain support, and roughly the same number felt that land conflicts would not make a difference. Pastoralists who responded to the survey in each country also had different views on why young people joined jihadist groups. Respondents in Benin placed more emphasis on poverty and religious preaching, while in Mali, respondents highlighted personal emancipation as one of the most important factors. And I'd like to point out that the survey was not able to explore the connections between these different responses, and this would be an important area for future qualitative research. What's clear in Western Mali and reportedly in Northern Benin is that insurgents are using religion as an entry point into households and communities. Another important difference between these two areas is that pastoral resource scarcity and land pressure are far greater in Northern Benin than in Western Mali. This difference showed up abundantly in survey responses. Pastoralists are far more worried about illegal logging in Mali than in Benin, partly because it does not take place in Part W due to more effective surveillance and institutional differences between the two countries. In Northern Benin, herders are desperate to protect access to whatever land they have left. I want to go into more detail on this point about differences because it illustrates that herder-park relations are more complex than they are often described to be. Again, this echoes Alice Kelly's study of Waza National Park in Cameroon, where the Boko Haram insurgency continues to affect local security. That study showed that many communities position themselves as local and negotiate informal access to resources within the park, whose managers help them by excluding outsiders who hope for the same. Local and outsider in this context are defined through their relationships with park authority, which is territorialized by the park boundary. When that authority becomes weak, outsiders were able to encroach at the expense of users who enjoy the status of local. In Northern Benin, grazing lands are rapidly disappearing, and pastoralists seem to view the park as a way of securing territorial protection, not through encourage or declassification, degazetting of the park, but stronger enforcement of special use zones that would, in theory, guarantee them stronger resource rights in places like you see here. And this is, in fact, a far cry from how people-park relations are typically described in the region in the context of security. So to conclude, I want to describe what I call weak state political ecology as a more effective way of understanding the local dynamics that I'm discussing today. The weak state concept refers to the immense gap between official policy and on-the-ground governance in rural areas. Specifically, it means that states might be weak in rural areas, but state actors are not, especially when it comes to informal control of lucrative resources. To quote Morin Boas, we need to stop obsessing about what fragile and conflict-prone countries lack and start focusing on how they actually work. Here, I emphasize the relationship between informal markets and the state in the context of natural resources and armed conflict. Agriculture accounts for 1/3 of the region's economy, a large portion of which is in the informal sector. In Benin, the informal sector contributes to almost 60% of GDP and engages over 80% of the labor force. And that's a number worth considering for a moment, 80% of the labor force. Equally important is the fact that young people must rely on side hustles in the informal sector to access the money that they need to make a living. The most important of these, at least for young men, is artisanal mining, which remains informal because it is overburdened by regulation, and it is an attractive target of armed groups because there's a lot of money involved. Informality shades into criminality and is deeply relevant to understand the Sahelian crisis. Control of informal markets, including artisanal mining sites, wildlife poaching, smuggling, and logging networks, fund armed groups and bring them into the realm of the side hustle. In a perceptive study of the armed insurgency on the Burkina Faso side of Park W, the Noria Research Group describes that working for armed insurgencies can serve as a seasonal gig that fits with other mobility-based livelihood activities. And I found this to be very perceptive because my informants in the part of Western Mali under partial control of Katiba Messina describe almost exactly the same thing. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider the implications of this for militarized counterinsurgency efforts, including in and around Park W itself, where military patrols have killed civilian livestock herders. So we must take into account the politics of these informal livelihoods and how violence becomes an important political instrument in their control. Violence, or at least the threat of it, is an important means of control for state actors operating in the informal sector as well. I'm thinking of illegal logging, which brings me back to the beginning. Hardwood species like African rosewood, so easily trafficked abroad, are also the ones that pastoralist herders rely on to feed their livestock. Those trees are rare outside of protected forests, which only increase the control of state forestry agents and the profits they are able to enjoy. Trade statistics show that global demand for West African varieties of rosewood, one in particular, has exploded in recent years, especially in China, resulting in its listing as an endangered species in 2016. Herders would be the first to tell you that the rosewood trees have practically disappeared, which makes the fines that they receive and the abuse that they receive from forestry agents all the more infuriating. They're not even getting a good product, rosewood leaves, for what they're paying. At least when they could find rosewood and African mahogany trees seen on the right, those fines represented an informal market transaction of sorts, as long as the fine was reasonable and didn't involve getting beat up. So as resources diminish outside of protected areas, they become even more important as sites of predatory governance and the political economic systems of informality that they generate. The most important syndrome is the focus on highly codified and centralized management of resources that creates incentives for stakeholders to operate in the informal sector and discourages the kind of inclusive stewardship that is desperately needed and frequently touted. This syndrome perpetuates the political marginalization and economic stagnation of rural areas. Norio research is insightful again in describing how the use of violence as a political tool transforms local societies. This accurately describes the dynamics at work in Western Mali, where the presence of armed groups worsens or even generates intercommunal strife as one group arms itself out of fear of attack or in order to carry out a reprisal after one. Hunters associations, which are made up of ordinary farmers, and they're highly mediatized, as probably you've seen, are not wrong to seek lethal weapons when the state offers virtually nothing in the way of security. This has important implications because it suggests that we cannot reduce these conflicts to the local scale, as many suggest, even when they are struggles over natural resources that are diminished by climate change. Those resources are illegally bought and sold on international markets, and that profoundly affects relationships between rural resource users and state actors. I do not say the state because that's a misleading concept in this context. We need to understand state actors through their own actions. As anthropologist Louisa Lombard argues for the case of the Central African Republic, rural residents want a state that works for them. They want a state that provides entitlements more than anything else, most notably security and the means to make a living. Claims that there are cultural barriers to successful democracy in Western Africa, or to put differently, that the democratic nation state has failed because it is a foreign import, are nonsense. What angers farmers and herders alike more than anything else is when people come and illegally extract resources that they need, while those nominally in charge either do nothing or personally benefit. Rural people just want foresters and the police to do their job. Thank you. I think this is a good place to stop, and I really look forward to your questions and to discussing these important issues with you. I have a few acknowledgements here, and thank you very much.